Hello everyone. In this video, I'd like to address a point that was brought up in a recent series of videos between Sargon of Akkad and a series of libertarians. I don't want to respond to everything in his video because other people have done that, and I think it would be a lot to respond to, quite honestly. But he brings up a very common point. Uh, he brings up several very common points, so I don't want to diminish it by making it sound like he only brought up one. He brought up several. Um, but one that I hear an awful lot, and it's actually one of a point that I believed for a long time, but it was um, basically changing my mind on this, realizing that this was an accurate understanding of the world that kind of pushed me into anarcho-capitalism all those years ago, and that is the argument that what the state is when we all come together to solve problems that can't be solved through non-state uh, alternatives. So while it may be true that we can have certain consumer goods and certain services and certain things without state, without a government, there are certain things that we need government for, and that's why we all come together and create governments for that reason. Now, of course, what those things are, what we need the government to produce versus what we don't need it to produce, you get different lists from different people, which itself is kind of an indication that maybe there's something wrong with the argument, right? If it's something that's essential that only the government can do, how come the list of what's essential is not always the same? There are places, for instance, where healthcare is clearly not provided by the government. And now maybe you could argue that it's not provided as well as it would be with the government, but it clearly can. And so obviously you don't have to have a state to have healthcare. Maybe you think state healthcare is better than non-state healthcare, but you can still have healthcare without a state. Um, but then you have other places that would say, oh no, you have to have healthcare um, as one of the things that can't be taken care of without a government. Um, and that's one issue with it. But I think what really kind of um, changed my mind is to realize that that's not how states formed, right? We when states formed, if we're going way back, and they formed at different times and different periods, there is not a ton of evidence one way or another, right? There isn't a lot of documentation about the first states in Egypt or Mesopotamia, or even the first states in Northern Europe. But what we do have, and what we know about the process, is the idea that the genesis of states was when a group of people, any group at all, let alone of the entire population, got together and said, we have a list of problems that can only be solved if we cooperate in a fashion that involves the creation of an institution that is effectively a state. Um, that type of genesis never happened. There's no evidence of it. I mean, granted, sometimes we can't see exactly when it happened, but so that means, for one, you can't say, well, we don't really know, so that must be what happened. We're not really sure, when the first Pharaoh ruled in Egypt. We're just for shorthand say that the first state in Egypt was a Pharaoh. Um, like, we don't know that the first Pharaoh was elected or selected by people all coming together and saying, we need to have somebody who's the sovereign, who's the ruler over us, to solve problems that we couldn't solve any other way. So let's pick a pharaoh. There's precisely zero evidence that that's what happened. What we do know from the material that is available is actually quite different from that. It's clearly a case of ruling might makes right, of military leaders, tribal leaders, martial people with martial ability, basically taking power. And if you look, the most famous kind of, in the case of Egypt anyway, artifact on the creation of the state of Egypt is something called the Narmer palette. And for a long time I've thought about making a video just about the Narmer palette, but if you want, you can go online and look at pictures of it. And it's the picture of Narmer, sometimes thought perhaps to be the Scorpion King, although I think that is debated, um, smiting someone. He's holding a person prostrate, and he has a club over his head, which is the motif of uh, Egyptian kingship from then all the way up to the Roman period. And he is smiting, he is clubbing this subservient person. And this, most people tend to think, there's a lot of debate about what's exactly meant by the Narmer palette, but it's clear that he is subjugating people. And the archaeologists say that the Narmer came from probably, let's see, Upper Egypt, so the higher upstream, farther from the mouth of the Mediterranean, and farther from the delta, and that in the course of his reign, whoever Narmer was, that he took over Lower Egypt, the delta basically. And there was a city there that's being excavated today called Buto. Now we don't know if Buto is what's shown in the Narmer palette or not. Speculation that it is, but it's speculation at this point. But you know, the implication seems to be that Narmer conquered this area of Lower Egypt, and that this is depicting that, and that these people that he's smiting, they're not Libyans or Asiatics or foreign invaders or anything like that. These are people that he is subjugating. So the idea that uh, the Egyptians got together and said, "We have problems we need to solve. Let's have a leader," is quite laughable. Uh, this is a person who is taking power. Now, granted, the chances that Narmer is the first pharaoh, the first king, the state emerged with his personality, is a simplification, but it's also an accurate, I think, representation of a process that was happening. And for those of you who are interested, I've referenced this book before, but I highly recommend it. It's not by a libertarian, it's not about libertarianism, but it chronicles the development of war, and when it's uh, and through its genesis of the state. And that's a book called On War by a gentleman named Azar Gott, an Israeli historian. I've highly recommended that book in the past. I will highly recommend it again now. But he goes into a lot of detail about what we know about the organization of states. And there is nothing in that book that says it's because they read John Rawls and they decided, let's make a society that's the most fair to the most people. It's not because they identified the free rider problem and they thought, oh, we need to have a pharaoh or a king or an emperor who will solve the free rider problem by subjugating non-paying, peasants, or to provide for public goods, you know, uh, none of that. It wasn't like Narmer was solving the free rider problem one burned village at a time. Um, and there's actually, I remember National Geographic did a whole article on the Narmer palette at one point a few years ago, and they had artists who like tried to show what they thought, and this is again a historical guess, but one that's supported by what evidence we have of, what what event might have inspired the Narmer palette, and it's a picture of Narmer, yeah, smiting a victim who's already been maimed to the point of being unable to resist, if not already dead, as the forces of Narmer burn a village to the ground. I think in the case of Buto, the city I mentioned before, it was burned. And the idea of that, well, they all came together to form a state to solve their problems collectively, and that's what states are about. No, it was a brutal conquest. And what's another kind of interesting thing is there's the whole argument here for might makes right and all that, and very few people who try and justify the states make this argument. But when it comes right down to it, the criteria for them deciding who is sovereign is based on it, right? So the the social contract theory, I don't want to just talk about the problems with that. There's many things that could be said, but one thing that seems to be that your consent is implicit unless you can do one of two things. One, well, maybe there might be other options that are less common, but you can escape. If you can escape the state and go someplace where it doesn't exist, then that's one way to say, well, I don't consent to the social contract. And I suppose by escape, you could even not necessarily leave the country, but if you were able to, conceal yourself, through aliases or whatever, I suppose that's the option. The other option is it's not enough to say that you no longer consent. It's not enough to vote that you no longer consent. Um, and it's not even enough for you to rebel and say that you don't consent. You can physically rebel by force of arms and say, I so much do not consent that I'm going to risk uh, physical violence to achieve independence. That's not even enough unless you actually win, right? So if you launch a rebellion, let's say, and even if it lasts 4 years and results in the deaths of, I don't know, 850,000 soldiers or men, uh, that is somehow not a strong enough indication that you have withdrawn your consent unless you are victorious at the end. Now, this is essentially a might makes right argument. Now, might makes right does not jive, does not sit well with the liberal inculcated values that we all have. And I don't mean liberal in like the classic in the American political sense, but in the more general sense that embraces things like reason and tolerance and all that. The might makes right. Yeah, it worked for an Assyrian king, it worked for an Egyptian king, it worked for a Roman emperor to a point anyway. It doesn't sound as good today, and so people who rationalize government will not will only very rarely. I've seen it maybe once or twice, but only very rarely will they say, justify it as an argument of might makes right. Um, but when it comes down to who's sovereign or not, as Sargon said in his video, just to use him as an example, and I'll say I like Sargon by and large. Um, he's like, the difference between you asserting that you're a state and a state is that a state can enforce it, and that your legitimate, its legitimacy is predicated on its ability to project its force. That's the might makes right argument. And so I would only ask that people who have a philosophy that's based on that just be honest about it and stop pretending like it is something that people positively assent to, and that it's some kind of um, cooperative organization. And it is like there is certain elements of the state that are cooperative. You have special interests who cooperate with the state. You have other elements within society who cooperate with each other to use the power of the state to their advantage relative to everybody else. So there is cooperation in that sense, but there's not cooperation between those with the political power and those who are the recipients or the non-beneficiaries of that political power. Um, so I just wish people would be more honest, and instead of saying, "Oh, this is all something that you agree to," they're just saying you are being coerced, you're being forced into this. This is a rigged system. The fact that voting goes on, that's an appeal. People have a lot of emotional attachment to the idea of democracy and voting. And one thing that Sargon, he's not alone in this, so it bears pointing out, is to say the democratically elected representatives, the democratically elected representatives. So I've done, not just me, but like if you critically analyze whether it be direct democracy or representative democracy, especially as it exists in our system today, but how it would hypothetically exist in any system. So this isn't a critique only of, say, the American system or the British system or a Western system, uh, is riddled with flaws. When you have the government in the position to uh, say who can vote, when they can vote, who will be on the ballot, what districts are which. I mean, gerrymandering gives you the ability to control the outcome of election to a huge degree, to control ballot access, to control, to have elections only be so often, to only allow so many people on the ballot, to bundle issues. Then you have things like rational ignorance, you have demagoguery, you have a whole host of things that incentivize against this being any kind of effective check against the government. And also, since whether you be part of the state or not is never something that's actually on the ballot, it's erroneous to say, well, they picked Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, let's just say, so that proves that they are, anyone who voted that way is assenting to the government entirely. Um, we can't really impute that much about what people want through a vote. Also, what politicians say when they're running for election, the promises that they make, the speeches that they say, are non-binding. There's no way to, and I mean, this is going to tangentially go into like a video about the social contract, which I don't want to do. Very easily could go there, but that would be a whole other video. But just the idea that this is where states come from is completely false. If we, in most cases, we don't know that much, but what we do know indicates that these are, and again, to use Egypt, what did the, and this is the first thing in my head back, and it wasn't Egypt. I was actually reading about 19th century Russia, reading about the czars, and the thing that struck me, and if you read War and Peace, the czar is always referred to as the sovereign. They never call him the czar. He's called the sovereign. The sovereignty in Russia was vested in this one person, basically. And if you look at his actions and his policies, and I say his, I could be referring to any of the czars or any monarch in history for that matter, and you go in on the premise that the reason that they exist is to solve problems that we can't solve on our own, and to, whatever, whether it's to solve the free rider problem, or to provide public goods, or to provide utilities that can't be provided through other means, or to defend everyone, which I guess is a subset of these other ones. Um, if that is your, or some kind of Benthamite notion of the most good for the most people, if that's what you assume the reason for states is, and you look at their actions, they don't mesh with that very well. They mesh much better with the proposition that they are self-interested, and that they use the state for their own benefit, and that they have to cooperate with other people. A single individual is not going to have the physical coercive potential to rule over such a large number of people. So it's necessary to make alliances, and there are all sorts of alliances that have been made historically. Between a religion is very common. To go to some sort of priest class and say, you know, uh, rationalize my rule religiously, make up something about how the Nile, there won't be any inundation, the sun won't rise, uh, there'll be a loss of order. Ancient Egypt, they considered order. They had a word for it called Mot, and that without the Pharaoh, not only would there be no annual flooding of the Nile, no inundation, and no rising of the sun, but the Mot order would be gone. And he would go to the priest and say, "Well, purport this as divine." And of course, if for some reason the priestly caste objected, he'd say, "Well, my generals will kill you, and we'll find a new priest who agrees. And for your trouble, we'll have some kind of arrangement. Maybe you'll be uh, won't have to pay taxes, or you'll pay lower taxes, or you'll get to keep your priestly estates, or whatever it is. Or maybe it's an alliance with the military, with military forces. Like, okay, you serve me, you serve my interests, and then you don't have to work for a living. You can just live on the dole of everyone else." Or maybe it's with a merchant class, or bankers, or uh, property owners, or whoever. And there's been many examples through history. You don't see people ruling completely on their own, even with absolute monarchs. They always have to share power with a few people, a few groups anyway. But if you look at what they're doing, it's what's best for them. They build palaces for themselves. It's most obvious in cases like Egypt, where they're doing things like building the pyramids. It's a tomb for a single person. It has no other function, unless you believe that it's an alien spaceship or whatever, which is ridiculous. But you're talking about you're talking about a project. In Egypt is, again, a classic good example. It's one of the better known, and part of the reason it's better known is they built so much out of stone, and so a lot of stuff has remained. Whereas places that built stuff out of mud brick or used papyrus more frequently, I'm sure they use those in Egypt, but uh, that there's just not as much that's remained. But you're talking about, those pyramids probably took decades to build. If we're talking about the Great Pyramids, for instance, there are many others that weren't quite as big but still took a lot. You're talking about a huge portion of the total labor output of the entire country, 4 or 5 million people, uh, just to build a tomb. Uh, we don't know what the death rate, by the way, working in these places was. The Egyptians basically didn't care. They have found some inscriptions um, for logistical reasons seem to indicate that a death rate in a season for a work gang doing heavy labor like that could have been somewhere around 10%. And that's an estimate. We don't really know for sure, but imagining what it would have taken to build, it seems highly reasonable that a lot of people would have been dying. That's every year for years, and it's like, is the pyramid like a giant granary? Is it a canal? Is it a utility of any kind? Is it it's just, or is it a manifestation of the vanity of of a ruler? And they weren't shy about their own vanity too. So like it's quite a stretch to argue otherwise. And those are just an example, but if they weren't building pyramids, they were building temples, they were building entire cities to their name, they were building palaces, like those in Pyrameses, uh, constantly, like always. That is what they were doing with their money. And yes, they had militaries, and yes, they would fight off people who would come and try and rob them of their estate, basically. And yes, sometimes they would realize that it might help their investment to build a canal here or build a dam there. Just like, a person who owns a lot of stock, who has a personal portfolio, might reinvest some of his money into his portfolio. You wouldn't say, oh, he's donating this because he wants to help the Roth IRA because he loves the Roth IRA so much. It's like, no, he's trying to get rich off of it. He's trying to aggrandize himself. Obviously, you have to kind of assume, and this is going into another argument, you kind of have to assume that they are morally superior, that they're more altruistic, that they're not self-interested, and that they don't respond to incentives in the same way that other people do in order to ignore the blatant fact that this is what's going on. Now, you could say, oh, lengthy unearther, maybe that's true for Egypt, maybe that's true in Mesopotamia, and whatever else, and the Mayans and the Aztec and all these old, but like we don't live in societies with monarchs anymore. Well, that's not entirely true if you live in the UK and a lot of other places, but or Japan. Um, but now we have parliaments and congresses and representatives, and those origins of the state, those happened a long time ago. And now the state is us all coming together. Well, the problem with that is that the states of today, even when they lack monarchs and have congresses and parliaments and elected representatives of some form or another, uh, these are successor systems that filled the role that the earlier monarchs had started. So it wasn't like in the case of the United States that there was nothing, and then we all came together and we said, let's all solve our problems together, and we'll have a giant meeting of all the people in the Americas, except obviously women and blacks and Native Americans, but like all white people. Not even that. It's not like they all got together and then through consensus decided there's certain things that we can do on our own, and there's certain things that we have to have a government to do, and let's form a government to do it. Now, there were, of course, people who philosophically believed that, like the founding fathers. They wrote about it. They believed that you need a government for that reason, but that's not where the state comes from. The state, the every one of the 13 colonies was based on a history that involved conquest, that involved the sovereignty of the British monarch, uh, granting land, granting charters, granting, uh, whether it was to a company or to an individual or to himself. You had royal colonies that were directly administered by by the crown, or colonies that were given charters by the crown. But these places wasn't like they arose out of nothing. They came from this past. It was based on the sword, of what they could steal and take from, first of all, Native Americans, second of all, other Europeans. These conventions, these constitutional conventions, never included everyone. Again, not even to point out, black Africans, whether they were slave or not, in most cases, uh, women, Native Americans, whose views were completely ignored. But even, among white people, even among property owning white people. You know, you have a self-appointed legislature that is based on a very limited franchise, and then only some majority of that. Most of the people are either ambivalent or unaware of what's going on. Some of them are supportive, although we don't know. Again, when someone votes for someone, we don't know what level of support they are conveying through that ballot, right? Is somebody who votes for Hillary Clinton saying, I support Hillary Clinton in all things, and whatever she wants, I want. Whatever policy she wants, I want. And or are they saying, I really just don't like Trump. I prefer her evil. She's the lesser of two evils. Even if I literally agree with her on almost nothing, I just don't think she's as bad. Can you tell the difference between those two? Those are very different in terms of their implications, in terms of what you're delegating to that person. Um, you can't, and you can't when you couldn't then, and you can't now. So you're 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 imputing so much more that's not there when you just say, well, we all came together. It was a controlled process. Now, I'm not one to say, well, I'm so cynical that all the founding fathers and all the people in these legislatures, they were all like, oh, we're the state, we're all in on it, and we're all here to rob from everybody else. I don't think that many people, especially in the more liberal democratic societies, actively view their role as such. But that is what it's incentivized to be. That's how it functions. Um, if we look, oh, it's here to protect everyone. And there was so much in Sargon's video that does come down to, like, it's funny too, because he's like, I'm pragmatic, you're idealistic. Uh, there's so much that was not pragmatic. The idea that, well, we need regulations, to protect us from rapacious companies. Um, Almost all regulations, if not all, are a form of rent seeking. Almost all of them are drafted by, supported by, and passed with this explicit endorsement of whatever industry is being regulated. Because all regulations are going to have beneficial results and favoritistic results for at least some producers, even if that's not the intention. Let's say that regulators in the government are completely uncorrupt, and at no point even consider helping one industry player over another, but they come out with a regulation that they think is going to make everything better. The practical effect of that regulation is not going to be equal among all members of the market. There are some members of the market who are going to be able to conform with or work around that regulation better than others. And so they are, in this case, accidentally at least, subsidized. Competition is reduced accidentally. But that is a very rare regulation indeed. Most of the time, it's a tailor-made regulation that is designed from its genesis until its passage and its enforcement to restrict competition, which will raise costs for consumers and lower choices for consumers, and raise market share, and often as a result profits for whatever company is benefiting from it. And you can be as idealistic as you want and ignore that, or having not ignored that, say, well, I'm going to propose that we have some kind of new regulation that will not allow that sort of corruption. There's lots of forms of corruption. There's the type of corruption that most people think about, which is a suitcase full of money and whatever else. But corruption has a much broader, more basic understanding. It's corrupted by a bias, and you can have a law that says you can't donate to regulators, but we all know that there's a revolving door, that if you are a regulator, if you're high enough up in the bureaucracy, that when you retire, you can make good money working directly for one of the companies you were previously regulating, or as a consultant to one of those companies, or a firm that offers consulting services, or a lobbying group that lobbies the government back, and there's no law you can make that can prevent that workaround. The power, it's very interesting. I think a lot of people who pride themselves on being pragmatic, they kind of assume that humans can only act on interactions of the first order. You know, I see what you're going to do and I react to it. They don't understand that you can realize what they're going to do, realize how they'll react to your reaction, and you can do it many, many, many times over. Uh, so you can make a law that says, "Oh, we can't lobby." Well, okay, so they can just hire the people after, and it's understood that they can get a cushy job, or at least a highly remunerative job, if not a cushy one, afterwards. The regulatory agencies need the industries that they regulate. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a position to be there, and so it's a clear example of the state working for the advantages of some against the interests of everybody else. And you can recognize that. You can uh, ignore it, or you can rationalize it and be like, well, maybe that's how it's working this time, but I imagine a hypothetical system where that doesn't happen. And this is where it's also a little ironic, where you're idealistic and saying, oh, you libertarians are so non-pragmatic and idealistic. I'm imagining a perfect state where when there isn't corruption, where regulators only do what's best for the common good and not influenced by any other interest. And of course, there's problems with that too. Like, you know, when I was reading about these old states, they were doing things that I was like, well, that's obviously wrong. I had a list of things I thought the government should do, and they were not conforming to it, and so obviously those were bad states, and they were obviously doing things that were good for the sovereign or good for the ruling class, but not for everyone else necessarily. But another problem with that is like that was my list. Someone else could come up with a different list of things that they think the government should do, and it's very hard to objectively or scientifically prove which list is correct, which means they're all correct or they're all wrong, and basically the state can do anything, and it's going to conform to somebody's desires. And so that's why no matter what Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton do, they can always find somebody that they can pull out and say, "This, I'm doing something, and this person supports it." And so it's not just me doing what I want. It's doing what the will of the people want, as interpreted by me. And the will of the people, of course, can't be interpreted. There's no way to prove what it is. The electioneering process is a joke if that's what you think it does. Um, and it's just a way to rationalize. It's not a it's all us coming together, and it's all us working to solve our problems. This isn't an explanation of the origins of the state. It's not even a convincing explanation of what the state does now, how it functions. It's just a rationalization of its power. It's an attempt to say it's coercive monopoly to the extent that it has one. And I think that's actually debatable, but its legitimacy, its political authority are all justified because it's necessary. It's a necessary evil, as so many people like to say. And this is the rationalization of it, but it's not a description. All right, certainly not in the origin, and not even as it functions today. And because of the vagaries of things like the the common good, the general welfare, it's evil. It's very easy to twist any action taken on part of a state and saying, "Oh no, no, this isn't a self-interested action." When they build bomb shelters for themselves, when they aggrandize themselves, when they build monuments to themselves, when they uh, control infrastructure in a very cronyistic way, whether it's through corporations or through unions or through their political friends. That well, no, no, that can be construed as the common good because the common good is almost indefinite, right? I think Hayek said in Road to Serfdom, the common good is not a sufficiently definite phrase to have an actual definition, right? You could say anything is for the common good, plausibly even, and so that means it doesn't really mean anything. And I think this is definitely the case. So I think that these arguments about what the state is for, they don't explain how it came about. In fact, it's actually kind of laughable to assume that states formed in this way, that people got together and whether it be Mesoamerica or Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley or later in the northern European plains, they said, oh gosh, I mean, things are going okay, but like Jesus, we really need somebody who can, build the roads, and who can build canals, and who can have the law, and another problem with this kind of this argument that's like, well, if we don't have a state doing that, then these things can't be done. And we just have too much counterfactual evidence of these things happening without states. Now, you could make a more sophisticated argument that sure, people can survive in a stateless society. That's just a fact. Um, but it's still, you could still make a very good argument for a government though, and saying, well, yeah, sure, people can live. You can have laws, and you can have sophisticated trade and technology and goods and services without a government, because we have examples of that happening. But it wouldn't be as good, right? Like, there would be suboptimal production of certain goods. There would be suboptimal amount of order and too much chaos, um, and relative to with a state. But then that's not the argument that's ever made. The argument is always just kind of assumed, absent a state, there would be nothing. It would be chaos. It would be the Hobbesian war of all against all, and so I think that that's a very, very weak argument. The stronger argument would be to try and say, well, people can cooperate in either system. It's Is there more cooperation or less cooperation, and is there more optimal or less optimal? And that's just an argument people don't make because they're lazy, basically. I mean, they're lazy in this argument. I don't want to say they're generally lazy in all things or anything, but they just accept. And this is another thing. If Pharaoh made an inscription that said that he won a great victory over his enemies in Libya or Kadesh or wherever else, a lot of historians are very skeptical when a king says that he had a great victory over an enemy, uh, but or says something that's patently absurd, like, I conquered all the lands under the sun or whatever. But then if he says something like, I created order, or I brought laws to everyone, or then these are like Hammurabi would be a good example of this. Hammurabi's law code, and Hammurabi boasts about what he's brought to society, and people then for some reason uncritically accept this as a historical fact and not something that might be a boast. Like, as if, when Barack Obama says that he's created jobs, or that Obamacare has made healthcare more accessible, or that he's helping the world become safe for democracy, or freeing people, or killing terrorists. There's at least, it's understood that you can be skeptical of those claims. In fact, and depending on the claim, sometimes it's laughable that would be said. But then when they read about it on some stone stela, that a king who buried himself in a gigantic tomb encased in gold says that he brought order, and that he brought prosperity, then people say, oh yeah, he definitely did. It's a good thing. It's a good thing the people of Egypt got together and had Pharaoh solve the free rider problem, because here it says right here, Pharaoh says it himself, that he made Egypt better. That, I mean, that's not to say that because he says it, it's not true, but it's also hardly evidence that it is. And we see that there's a decent disconnection between economic prosperity and well-being, and the um, machinations and activities of the state. And that's nowadays, but then we take it at face value when it's carved in stone, apparently. But not when he said, but it's very interesting when they make claims vis-a-vis other states, then it's all of a sudden like, yeah, Ramses maybe didn't have a great victory at Kadesh. Um, but if he says he helped Egypt, then, we'll just accept that. Um, so there's that problem, and I mean, there's so much that is just kind of taken for granted and just assumed. Uh, that as long as they say, and this is a problem with legitimacy too, like it's like their legitimacy is assumed, and if you question their legitimacy, you can't, because the only legitimate authority is them. They're the arbiter of their own power. They're the arbiter of the social contract. This goes down to why the social contract really doesn't work. Um, You can say that they have obligations, but they have to be the ones that say they have obligations, and they have to decide that they violated those obligations. And if they don't, you don't have a leg to stand on. The only way you can hold the state accountable outside of its own apparatus is through distinctly anti-state, anti-government things like revolutions, militias, that sort of thing. There is no check and balance within the state on the state. The checks and balances, and they do exist. There are checks and balances, but they exist outside the state. It's fear of the potential non-political repercussions that, to the extent there is a check, you know, at all. I think there should be more. I think that I'm not pleased with the limits to the checks there. I wish that let's say we had a better armed society that had more uh, non-state organization within it, which would present the state with uh, more plausible alternatives of resistance, and I mean that in the broadest sense, resistance, not necessarily in the martial sense, but that as well. Um, so yeah, I think that it's profoundly wishful to believe that states were formed in this way, or that at some point in their genealogy and their history that they morphed into something. Once it's established, once Pharaoh has conquered Egypt and he starts to share power, it's inevitable. It's almost inevitable that you're going to have a cadre of people uh, that are benefited by the system, who are incentivized to keep the system going, and it makes sense for them to develop ideologies, or if they don't develop them, to the encourage the development of others of ideologies that legitimize that rule. And it's very possible that at some point you could end up with a parliament, and that wouldn't really change how it started. It wouldn't really change that the people who live under the parliament have as little choice as the people who lived under Pharaoh or the king, in terms of whether they are ruled or not. It wouldn't change that the borders of the society, that the polis, the political unit, it wasn't defined or decided by vote or by consensus or by consent, but by the sword. I think we can have all these debates about how states could form, and hypothetically they could form in that way, right? It's not scientifically impossible for people to get together and say, let's form a state, and whatnot. But it's one thing to say some people; it's quite another to then extend that to all people, and that's not how the states were. They always were extended by the sword, by violence, and then basically going over the people and saying, look, you submit to our rule, and if you cooperate, maybe we'll allow you to have votes, we'll allow you to have an election, we'll allow you to, people in your society, in the area that we rule, give them a stake if possible in the state to give them an incentive to remain there. But you don't have the chance to vote to leave. You don't have the ability to just leave on your own accord without going through the system. So I think it's very disingenuous, or very, if not disingenuous, because I think, well, that's probably a bad word, because people could genuinely believe this, but it's a very idealistic and unrealistic version of events. It's very, uh, you're substituting the actual state, the actual government, and its actual history with the hypothetical one, with saying, well, hypothetically, we could have gotten together and formed a government to solve the free rider problem, or the public goods problem, or whatever else. And so I'm going to say that that's how states started, and that's why states started, and that's how the state that we have today got to be there, when that's literally not the case, as far as we know. And it seems highly improbable that it's the case in any of the states that exist today or ever have. Um, and to say that that's why they function, you have to always be explaining why they're doing things contrary to that. If they exist for the common good, however that's defined, why are they constantly doing self-interested things? Why are they constantly aggrandizing themselves? Why are they constantly oppressing their people to one degree or another? Um, it, you have to well, you can't say it's always corruption, right? Why, if your system is always a corrupted system and never the system that you want, right? And people say, well, anarcho-capitalism has never really existed, so it can't really exist. No, that's a fallacy for one. But like, if when was the state that conformed to what you argue a state should live by? When was this perfect state, or if not perfect, optimal state that where corruption, and again, I mean corruption in the broadest sense, not just in the sense of politicians or bureaucrats taking bribes, but a state that is systematically dedicated to some kind of rational principle of the most good for the most people, which, to be fair, I think is a very problematic thing to have, right? How do you have a scientific or philosophical common good for everyone? But when was there a state that even like even rhetorically tried to do that, but practically made any kind of attempt to even reach that standard to be that way? I don't think there's any. I mean, if you can point to some and say, yeah, this state literally the way it functioned, the way it operated, the way it was set up, the way it formed was, to was to help everyone and not just, and it's not enough for the state itself to claim, well, that's what it's doing, right? It's not enough for them to say we exist to make everyone better, but then the king lives in a palace, bankrupts the country and has thousands of his own citizens killed in wars to take over little territories so he can have a slightly larger tax farm, or just for his own ego, even if he doesn't care about the money. Um, I'd be impressed if someone could show me a state that existed that way, and I wouldn't expect one that was perfectly uncorrupt, that never had any problems with all. But I don't see any that are even remotely founded on or operated under that on that basis at all. There never has been, and I don't know that there could be. I mean, maybe if you had a state where every single member was giving positive consent, where every single person said, "I'm signing up for the state. These are my expectations." You might then, but that's certainly never happened. So, except for places like Sealand and Freelandia, or these tiny micro things that most people wouldn't even consider states in the first place. So, anyway, um, it's actually good. I'm glad that we actually have something of a dialogue going on here. Sometimes it's shrill and sometimes it's annoying and sometimes people talk past each other, but kind of reminds me of the old days of YouTube when people actually had somewhat substantive debates, and I think this is the closest thing I've seen to it in a long time. So this is not a response to Sargon. It was just prompted because he's made some very commonly made comments, things that I've thought about making videos before, and maybe I have. I don't remember right now, but it would be something I thought worth going over again. So I went ahead and make this video. So I hope you all are having a great day, and I will talk to you another time.